With me today is Jonny Campbell. Jonny is the Associate National Director for Alpha in the UK, and he's going to be telling us more about what that job entails as we go through this conversation. And we really want to focus on how we can make the best of Alpha in our churches. Jonny, I was doing some research online, and I see that Alpha began, way back in 1977 at Holy Trinity Brompton. It's now, isn't it, an international phenomenon in so many countries around the world. It's been incredibly successful in bringing people to the Christian faith. A figure I found online, when I was trying to discover how many people in the UK had taken Alpha, and I found one figure that said something like 2.5 million people have taken it. I saw another figure that said that maybe as many as 5 million people have taken it, which is wonderful and great news, and hallelujah for that. But Jonny, where are these people, and why is it that we aren't seeing them in our pews and in our churches Sunday by Sunday?
It's a good question, Peter. Some of them are in my home church, and we have I'm part of a Presbyterian church in East Belfast here, and over the years we've done Alpha for about 25 years quite consistently, and over that time a whole section of the church on a Sunday morning has emerged where you get Alpha alumni and people that are coming through Alpha and then inviting family members and friends and colleagues and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's actually difficult to be precise about how many people in the UK over the last 30 years have done Alpha. I think my understanding is in the early stages of really explosive growth, we probably grew so quickly that the last 20 years or so have been focused on, in some ways, maybe catching up in terms of governance and all kinds of other things with that remarkable growth that we saw in the early movement. But I suppose the answer is that some people come to Alpha and never quite make the connection again with local church. Some people coming on Alpha, of course, are already part of local church and have been there all their lives. So in a sense, we don't really notice any impact on a Sunday morning then from their Alpha course. But I get the other wonderful part of it is that many of those people who have been through Alpha are in the church, and in lots and lots of cases are leading in church, and some of them have gone on to very influential leadership roles across all the kind of networks and denominations of the church in the UK. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I know you're very keen on is to ensure that the churches have, how shall I put it, the right sort of culture to make the most of Alpha, to make sure that Alpha works well, to make sure that people really come into the church, come to faith, and then become part of the worshiping community. I think you've got, if I recall, 5 main headings where you say that this is where we need to sort of change the culture of church. I think the first of them is something around creating a culture of prayer. Do you want to say more about that, Jonny?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think what I'm getting at with this stuff is Alpha. It is possible to do Alpha badly. Not all Alphas are equal, and there is a recipe with Alpha that tends to generate the most fruit and the most impact. And Alpha also grows in a soil, and soil is culture, and culture is just repeated behaviors over time, or as somebody else put it, the way we do things around here, and every church has a culture. So whether we're conscious of that or not, whether we make very proactive decisions about it or not. It's not that there's kind of some places there's a culture and other places there isn't. There's always culture, and it's just sometimes it's much more healthy and conducive to grow something like Alpha in, and a culture of prayer is really the starting point. I think because one of the sort of unusual observations I could make about Alpha is that it shouldn't really work. We're asking people for quite a commitment when we say, would you like to come along for 10 or 11 weeks? We're asking people to come and explore Christian faith, potentially in a community that they're not currently part of, an environment they're not maybe familiar with, and so on. And there are just all kinds of reasons why Alpha is sort of perfectly set up to fail. Unless God and the work of God is sort of the X factor in the whole equation. And I don't know how this particular magic works, and I don't really understand. I don't understand all the mechanics of it, but I do know that when churches pray, Alpha has a much better chance of thriving. And it's one of these funny things, Peter, because everybody knows that that's important, and in a sense, you don't have to teach any church community about the idea that prayer matters or that prayer makes a difference. But the thing that really moves the dial is some kind of mechanism for mobilizing people to pray. So there's a million ways to do that. One of my favorites that I came across, and it comes from HTB, where the Alpha course was born effectively. HTB used to do this little prayer campaign every term called the 1102 campaign. So in Luke 11, verse 2, Jesus is teaching the Lord's Prayer, and in verse 2 he prays, your kingdom come and your will be done. So every term at HTB, they would encourage the congregation to set an alarm on their phone at 2 minutes past 11. You can do that morning or evening or both, and to make a list of 3 or 4 people in our world who we would love to see come to know Jesus, and to do nothing more complicated than at 2 minutes past 11 every day to pray, to think about those people, to picture them in your mind, and just to pray, Lord, may your kingdom come and your will be done in the lives of those people. And it's amazing how a simple little mechanism like that keeps invitation on the radar of our people, because 95% of guests who do Alpha have been personally invited and brought. So the personal invitation thing is massive.
And what about prayer during the sessions themselves? I've heard of churches where they'll have a team actually praying during the Alpha evenings.
Yeah. And then you have group hosts and helpers with their phone under the table pressing a panic button. Something's come up in conversation I wasn't prepared for. Yeah, look, some churches do it. I think it probably comes down to resources in terms of people, and I'm not unaware. Like I love HTB. It's like a second home for me, and I've been there and I've seen 1,000 young people beating down the doors to get into Alpha. I think it's wonderful, but I know that the overwhelming majority of churches don't look like that, and often the biggest challenge running Alpha is to make resources stretch in terms of people and money and time and energy. And I think if you have some people who really love to pray and intercede, I think it's a wonderful thing that people would be praying in real time as Alpha is happening. And it is so often those like small group conversations are the place where so much of the magic happens, and guests are are getting this amazing plausibility structure for Christian faith, and they're seeing the credibility of it in somebody else's life. And yeah, I think then the Spirit starts to speak to them, and it's great.
So that's the cultural change around prayer.
Yeah.
What about hospitality, invitation? I think that's something else you've spoken about, the importance of invitation alongside that prayer, Jonny.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we've studied this and we've researched it over time, and we're very confident that 94.6, I think, at the last count, percent of guests who actually come on Alpha have been personally invited and brought. So if you were ever in any doubt about how a guest comes on Alpha, it is because they trust someone. It's because they know someone who has a Christian faith, and there's enough relational capital there that they place a little bit of trust in them, and they come along. So, and of course, a vicar hasn't a hope really of personally inviting and bringing along 15, 20, 25 people. It's really on a congregation to meaningfully engage with the world around them and to have that kind of relationship. And gosh, there's so much I could say about this. I think, I mean, it begins with knowing people outside the church well enough that we actually could invite. I think the Evangelical Alliance did a survey last year that discovered 47% of practicing Christians in the UK feel like they don't have a really significant friendship with somebody outside the church that they could invite, so that I would say to church leaders, if you program the week within your church to within an inch of its life, and you expect people to commit to 3 or 4 evenings a week, you're filling your programs, but you're probably blunting your evangelistic kind of potential, because we need to, in a sense, I think in the next 10 or 15 years, rather than running squash clubs inside church, we need all of our people to go and join a squash club down the road. So it kind of it begins with knowing people, and then I think changing the culture on invitation takes time. We need invitation to be an incredibly normal thing in church, and a repeated thing as well. And that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. Jonny, you've talked about prayer. You've talked about invitation. I think hospitality is something that's really key for Alpha as well. How does that work within this format?
Yeah, I guess obviously, Peter, Alpha places an incredibly high value on hospitality, and hospitality is so key on Alpha, both emotional hospitality and environmental hospitality as well. I would be prepared to argue that I think leading with hospitality as a way of bringing about transformation in the lives of others is the way of Jesus. I think it was his primary strategy. He didn't seem to treat welcoming and eating and drinking and listening to people as a means to an end. I think he seemed to treat it almost like an end in itself. And I think ideally, Alpha is a place where, I think it was John Tyson said at the end of Alpha, people may still have all the questions they came with, but they're sobbing and they say, I've never felt so loved and listened to in all my life. And that's kind of the goal.
Is that what you mean, Jonny, by you used the phrase emotional hospitality? What does that mean for you?
I think emotional hospitality for me, on a very simple level, it means that when people come along to Alpha, there's never a moment where they don't know what's going to happen next. And then I think it means in small group settings that it's less about Christians sharing their faith, which if I go along to an Alpha and I say, this is about me sharing my faith, it's all about me. Whereas if I say, this is about creating a wonderful space for you to explore the significance of faith in your life, now it's about you. And I think that cuts against the grain. I mean, I'm from evangelical Ulster, right? And I think leading with proclamation is sort of in our blood. And when we get on Alpha courses, at the first mention of what really happened in Genesis 1 or what did Paul mean in Romans 10, it's like it just all comes out of us, and we feel like we need to say all the right things and in the right order. So there's a little bit emotional hospitality is counterintuitive for many Christians.
I guess emotional hospitality can mean keeping quiet sometimes. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And listening.
Nicky said something recently where he said all these years we've been doing Alpha training for group leaders, and he said, I've just realized after 35 years of all these countless hours of group training, I can reduce it to 4 words: keep your mouth shut. and if you're gonna open your mouth, use it to ask a thoughtful question. Jesus was 40 times more likely to ask a question than give a direct answer. So there's probably something that we've lost there.
I think you've led me on to the next area that I know you're concerned about, which is the culture of encounter. What does that mean?
So I guess a culture of encounter is kind of based on some kind of theology of manifest presence, that I believe in God's omnipresence, that he's present everywhere all of the time, but I also believe in manifest presence, that in certain moments and spaces and places, to put it really crudely, in a way you hear all the time, God shows up, and people sort of become much more aware of his presence and love. And so I think Alpha is a journey for people that often begins with the cerebral. They maybe have some questions about the intellectual basis of Christian faith, or the reasons for Christian faith, and so on. But it's a journey that hopefully then proceeds to a place where the emotional life of a person meets with the truth, and so I guess in worship and in prayer ministry and being in nature, I guess in storytelling, there's lots of different ways. It borrows, I think, it sort of reincarnates some of the kind of principles and practices of ancient Celtic Christianity, where the emotional life was not to be, it wasn't something people were suspicious of or concerned about, but actually it was really integrated with the whole theology of what it means to know God. So yeah, the way I heard it explained once, Peter, and I thought this was brilliant. Somebody said to me once that Christians are so guilty in the story of the prodigal son. Sometimes Christians are so guilty of meeting this little lost boy on the road home and telling him, do you know what, I've got wonderful news for you. The Father has forgiven you. But not we have not been good at facilitating the meeting between the forgiving father and the boy on his way home, and I think Alpha is leading people to that place of we would love to hold the door open for you to actually meet with this Father who has forgiven you in real time. I don't know how well I've explained that, but that's the idea.
I get that, and I want to go on in a little while to talk about what the role is of church leaders in this specific. But I know the last, it's by no means least, but another critical area is around creating a culture of leadership development.
Yeah.
How does that play out in an Alpha context, Jonny?
Yeah, so it's probably I think a poorly understood aspect of alpha. So many people understand very well that it's about sharing faith and it's about evangelism, but I think alpha is also an environment where leaders develop very quickly because there's so many different roles that have to be worked at, and you know if you think of the sort of skill set required to host a whole room or to deliver a talk maybe or to facilitate conversation and lead people towards faith, very often it's alpha guests themselves who have come to faith that then come back and lead or facilitate groups. And I mean the acceleration then of their leadership potential and their skill set is often really remarkable. And so I think maybe that's almost like a secondary thing that is not always well understood, where churches have an alpha team and the alpha team doesn't really change maybe over 15 years, whereas it's the churches who are continually refreshing the team, continually taking little risks on people, watching for spiritual gifting showing itself, and creating a culture of I see in you, where we point that stuff out and we say I see in you that amazing ability to relate to people. Would you host this group next time? So yeah, that's the idea, I think.
Okay, so Jonny, we've talked through some very big things, very sort of briefly, and thank you for that. We've talked about a culture of prayer, a culture of invitation, a culture of hospitality, a culture of encounter, and a culture of leadership development. And it could be that a church leader just hearing you go through this just thinks, gosh, that is just so massive. All I thought I was doing was going to run an alpha course.
Yeah.
But one of the things that encourages me, that I think you have said elsewhere, is that it can take, I don't know, a number of years of running alpha, not just doing it once and then saying, did that work, but just to keep on and on with alpha. So how far is alpha a long-term project, and how many years can it take to put this sort of culture in place?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to churches all the time who maybe see alpha as a one-off event, and I always want to ask this question. I want to say, what's the bigger picture here? Do we want evangelism to be primary, preeminent, and preferred in the church, or is this something we will do once and not look at again? So I think the churches that really get the maximum benefit out of alpha have adopted it as a kind of operating system at the heart of church, rather than just an app in a marketplace of programs. So if alpha is the operating system, they know that it will run 2 or 3 times a year. In my home church, we run twice a year, every year, and we're very comfortable actually with small alphas. We don't mind if there's a bit of flux in attendance and so on. We know that alpha tends to generate a little bit of its own momentum because guests are always the best inviters and they're always the most relatable people for more guests, and so it probably takes a little while. It's like riding a bike. You just somehow have to keep the pedals turning over and sort of go for consistency rather than the novelty. And I genuinely think the cultures that I've talked about, alpha also helps to create. So there's a little bit of chicken and egg, but probably the 7th or 8th time that alpha runs, you begin to get a sense if it's really working or not. Because I definitely think if somebody was listening that hasn't run alpha in the local church in 25 years, but you've been considering it, the first time you run alpha, there's very often a great response because novelty drives a crowd in, and sometimes then that energy drops off quite significantly. But the truth is, most of the time, you've only really reached the church at at that point, because it takes a little while for people to feel confident to invite. So it's probably when you stick at it, and maybe the fourth or fifth or sixth time, you start to see people coming from outside the church, and people coming from outside church to explore faith and meeting Jesus. It like pumps blood, spiritual blood around a church like nothing else. It's just like the best thing ever. So I guess I'm saying is that don't ever be discouraged if you run Alpha twice or three times and it feels like it's really hard work, or it's struggling, because it is. And I'd be willing to bet by the sixth or seventh time you might begin to see momentum starting to grow.
So if somebody says to you, Jonny, I ran Alpha once and it just didn't work,
Yeah.
your advice to them would be just to keep on keeping on?
Yeah, it really would. I think I genuinely believe you can make a good assessment about whether Alpha is working when you've done it 6 or 7 times. It just takes that little bit of, and sometimes when people say Alpha didn't work, they maybe had a picture or a metric of success that was quite ambitious. They thought, oh, we need to fill a room, we need to have 40 people and so on. But do you know, Alpha around a kitchen table in someone's home with 3 or 4 guests is a beautiful thing, and there's nothing wrong with doing that for a few years and seeing where it leads you.
I'm very conscious that a lot of this is a preach magazine discussion, and I wonder where does preaching and teaching from the front or in small groups come into this? How can preachers and teachers really help Alpha be successful in their context?
It's definitely more connected than you think. So I think preaching and teaching fits probably within the wider conversation of the kind of culture that we experience on a Sunday. And I think we run into trouble sometimes if there's an enormous gap or disparity between the culture we have on Alpha, where there's this beautiful little fractal at times, and then if the culture on a Sunday is, for example, it maybe doesn't emphasize hospitality, or just feels, if it feels completely different. And in those circumstances, I've been there many times with churches in conversation, and all I could say is that the truth is your friend. And I think when you say it out loud, you've begun a wonderful journey of fixing it and closing that gap, But preaching as part of that culture, I think it can really help Alpha to thrive through consistency and coherence. So one of the dangers with preaching is if styles vary, and if maybe people that are involved in preaching and teaching ministry have a slightly different idea of what we're trying to do, you actually start to damage invitational confidence, because in a sense, I don't really know for sure if I reach out to my friend at a running club, say, I would love you to come with me to church, or I'd love you to come with me to Alpha. But if I can't be sure or reasonably confident of what we're going to get on Sunday morning, it makes that invitation much more difficult. And I guess I mean that even with reference to preaching. The thing that frightens me the most is a conversation in the car on the way home where I have to say to somebody, it's not always like that. So I think if churches can, and it probably doesn't really matter whether you've decided that stylistically you're going to preach for 50 minutes and the Sunday morning space is going to be where you do like deeper exploration of text, and where you do deeper kind of discipleship work. If that's what you've decided, that's fine. Just make sure it's consistent, and equally, if you've decided that Sunday mornings, the preaching space is where somebody speaks for 20 to 23 minutes, and they preach more to middle life issues, like anxiety at work or forgiving a friend or worries about money. And it's going to be a little bit more dynamic. It's going to be a little bit more like an alpha talk. If that's what you've decided, again, stick with it, because I think at least when there's a degree of consistency, I feel like I can invite my friend and I know exactly what they're going to get. So yeah,
that's really interesting, Jonny. This idea of consistency, because I guess in my mind I'm thinking of the disconnect between a very open style of an alpha conversation where questions and there's to and fro and you get a chance to interrogate.
Yeah.
And then someone comes to a Sunday morning and they're expected to sit where they sit, not question and listen to somebody giving a particular point of view, as I have done on many occasions. Is that too much of a culture shock for the person, or do we need to change the way we make Sunday mornings, Sunday evenings more like an alpha evening? Yeah. What do you think?
I honestly don't think it's problematic. I mean, I think people know what they're getting for the most part when they come along on a Sunday morning. I think they probably understand that it's not going to be a 25-minute video followed by a small group discussion. I think maybe the more problematic thing would be, so again, the emotional hospitality that I mentioned. I think I probably think on a Sunday morning, people should have that same experience where there's never a moment where they don't know what's going to happen next, where they don't know who it is that they're listening to and what their role is, where we sort of normalize explaining things in lay terms, because and I think every time we do that, we explain things in lay terms and we make a space to explain where kids ministry is and where it goes and where the toilets are and why we maybe do prayer ministry. All of those little moments of explanation, we're actually communicating to our own people that we expect people to be here every week who are exploring faith, who are at different stages of faith, all of that kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, there's so many different aspects of, I guess, a Sunday morning that you could dig into and you could talk about. But I just think there's a very simple question often, which is, how do people feel when they walk out the door at the end? Do they feel more expectant? Do they feel like they've been seen and heard? Do they feel loved? And do they feel like there was life there? And I think so much of that stuff that goes into the principles of alpha is quite transferable, even if the practices are completely different. I still want people to walk in. Like I talk about the wow factor on alpha. I want people to walk in and have their misconceptions about church kind of shaken a little bit. I want them to walk into alpha and go, oh my goodness, wow, I wasn't expecting that, whether it's cinnamon buns or the coffee or whatever. And I kind of feel the same way about church on a Sunday morning. I want people to walk in and go, oh my goodness, there's life here. And, wow, I wasn't expecting that. This looks nothing like my childhood experience of church that was a bit awkward. And, so maybe the practices are very different, but I think there's quite a lot of transferable principles.
Okay, yeah, I'm finding this really fascinating. Thank you, Jonny. What you're saying about is taking some of the practices and the things that are core to alpha and making them relate to the Sunday morning, the Sunday evening experience at your church, and having that wow factor. So thank you for that. I think we've in this time together, we've looked at the culture of prayer, we've looked at the culture of invitation, of hospitality, of encounter, and leadership development. I wonder if there was one thing coming out of this that you'd like to stress and emphasize as we come to a close. What what would it be?
Oh my goodness. I think I would love to say to listeners that evangelism, hospitality-led evangelism, very often leads to what I would call spiritual midwifery, and that's where you get to see something happening in somebody's life, and you're not doing it, but you get to be there, and you get to pray, you get to help, you get to be part of it, and there is just nothing like it to get spiritual blood pumping through church again. And so I guess I'd love to say, look, whatever steps you need to take to make evangelism primary and preeminent, you've got to have those conversations and take those steps, because it's just the best thing. And sometimes we're maybe aware that we're not there, that that we've got a bit of work to do, and maybe as one tiny little thing as well, Peter, I would say, don't underestimate the power of hospitality, not as a means to an end where we get to say what we want to say, but as an end in itself, for this moment that we're in.
Well, Jonny, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm sure many people watching this, listening to this, would have picked up so much to help them in the running of their Alpha courses. So thank you for that. And again, thank you for your time, and blessings on all your work.
Thanks for having me, Peter. I've really enjoyed chatting. We've got team up and down the country, so they actually they literally pay our pocket money to drink coffee with church leaders that are asking these kinds of questions, and to figure out a plan together about what we're going to do. So anywhere in the UK, we would love to sit down with you and figure out a way forward if this stuff is what you're thinking about and what you're hoping to do.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and I think we'll put the information about how to contact the Alpha team in the notes to this interview. So thank you again.
Thanks so much.